Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going way back. We're exploring something that might surprise you. The long, long cultural history of addiction.
Mm,
It's easy to think of it as, a modern crisis, something recent. But actually, when you dig into the past, our relationship with mind-altering substances, well, it has incredibly deep roots.
that's exactly right. And for this exploration, we've gathered some, well, really fascinating pieces. We'll be looking at a scientific study that gives us this huge overview of substance use through history.
Okay.
And then we've got some firsthand accounts that really zoom in on 19th century opiate addiction, particularly in America and England.
Right, the details.
Exactly. And insights into the whole era of patent medicines, too, which had a surprisingly big impact, actually.
So our goal today is to really try and understand how different societies across time have sort of made sense of and interacted with these psychoactive substances.
Yeah, how views changed.
Exactly. How societal beliefs, medical practices, even, economic realities shaped what we call addiction and how people dealt with it.
And crucially, thinking about what these historical patterns might tell us about the issues we're facing right now.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And we're going to start, well, at the very beginning, like really the beginning.
Our story starts, in the really, really distant past, hundreds of millions of years ago. There's some evidence suggesting early hominids might have interacted with certain psychoactive chemicals way back then.
Wow. Okay.
But what's interesting is, at that stage, it probably wasn't about changing their state of mind, like we think of substance use now.
So what was the point? What were they getting out of it 200 million years ago?
Well, the main idea is it was probably about nutrition, primarily.
Nutrition.
Yeah, see, certain plants have substances that are precursors to neurotransmitters, things like tyrosine, tryptophan. So it's thought early hominids might have consumed these plants just as a source of these nutrients. And what's key here is that these substances were likely very scarce. So the brain's reward system hadn't really developed that strong wanting or salience, that feeling that something's really important, grabby.
Right, the thing that drives addiction today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That wasn't really applicable then. It was more about basic survival needs than, say, craving.
So a completely different motivation than we usually associate with it, not chasing a high, but like essential brain food. Okay, so let's jump forward. A massive chunk of time. We start seeing things that look a bit more familiar, right?
Absolutely. By around, say, 40,000 years ago, we start finding solid evidence of psychoactive substances being used in ways that align more with cultural practices.
Like what?
For example, native Australians using nicotine. In the Americas, indigenous communities use both nicotine and coca. Khat was common in Ethiopia and North Africa.
Right.
We see coca used among Ecuadorian natives maybe 5,000 years ago, and even betel nut used by the Timorese way back like 13,000 years ago.
And they weren't just swallowing pills, I assume. The methods were varied.
Oh, definitely. The sources talk about buccal use, holding it in the cheek, oral consumption, rectal administration, and inhalation, like smoking. It really shows how varied and sort of integrated these substances were. Often, their use was deeply tied to religious ceremonies, healing practices, social customs. It wasn't automatically seen as a problem, It was just part of life.
It sounds like they were really woven into the fabric of everyday life in many ancient societies. And there's an evolutionary angle here too, isn't there? Something about plants and defense?
Yes, that's a fascinating aspect, this idea of coevolution. See, plants developed these psychoactive compounds originally as a defense mechanism.
Right, to stop animals eating them.
Exactly, to deter or even harm herbivores. But over time, humans who consume these plants might have experienced certain effects that maybe in some contexts were actually beneficial.
Like suppressing appetite? Or something else?
Maybe. Or perhaps altering perception in ways that were valued in rituals, This could have led to this kind of evolutionary back and forth. Plants produce more potent defense chemicals, allelochemicals they're called.
Yeah.
And human physiology may be adapted in various ways to handle or even utilize their effects.
Okay, so from these early, maybe more functional or ritual uses, let's shift focus to a substance with a particularly long and, significant history with humans, alcohol.
Oh, the story of alcohol is incredibly rich.
Yeah.
And complex. Archaeological evidence suggests wine production was happening in China as early as 7,000 BC.
Wow, 7,000 BC.
Yeah. From there, winemaking spread across the Caucasus, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and eventually all through the Mediterranean basin.
That's a really, really long history. And it wasn't just about, having a good time, was it?
Precisely. From the Neolithic period right up to the Industrial Revolution, Fermented drinks like wine and beer were valued for much more than just pleasure.
Like what else?
Well, they had antibacterial properties. Think
Yeah.
about that before clean water was common.
Crucial, yeah.
And analgesic, pain-relieving qualities. Plus, they were a significant source of high-energy nutrients.
Huh.
This made them economically valuable, too, especially when you consider where the fruits and cereals needed for brewing and winemaking grew.
So beer and wine were almost like food and medicine rolled into one for a huge chunk of history.
In many ways, yes. And their importance is really reflected in how many ancient cultures actually deified alcohol.
Right, like Dionysus.
Exactly. Dionysus in Greece, Bacchus for the Romans, the Hindu deity Varuni. Their prominence in mythology and religious practices just underscores the huge role alcohol played. And you see its influence in evolving customs and even early laws.
So alcohol had this really central, mostly positive role for millennia. How did that start to shift? Let's look at the early modern period in Europe.
Okay, so before the 17th century in Europe, alcohol, especially beer in Central and Northern Europe, was absolutely a staple, often consumed more than water because water could be unsafe.
Yep.
It was seen as nourishing, enjoyable, part of daily life. Brewing was often women's work, like baking. And beer was even a standard part of rations for European troops.
It's hard to imagine beer being a primary part of a soldier's diet today. Really shows how things have changed.
It certainly highlights a very different relationship. And heavy drinking wasn't necessarily frowned upon in the same way. In pre-industrial communities, it often served ceremonial, even nutritional purposes. Communal carousing, drinking competitions, these were pretty common, sometimes even expected.
But then the Reformation kicks in, 16th century, and attitudes start changing, right?
Exactly. The moderation movement gained steam during the Reformation. It started to strongly criticize what was seen as excessive drinking. Binge drinking, noisy festivals, fights, public drunkenness.
A moral shift.
Definitely. This period saw a big restructuring of the individual's relationship, not just with God, but also with earthly pleasures, including alcohol. Drunkenness started to be seen as a sign of moral weakness, a lack of self-control.
So a significant moral and religious shift starting to shape how people thought about drinking.
Yes, but the sources also point out that, just changing ideas wasn't enough to drastically alter habits overnight. Material factors were crucial.
Like what?
Economic power from geographical discoveries, the printing press, reducing the church's total dominance, and maybe most importantly, the growing need for a disciplined workforce. All these created a societal need for behavioral change.
And this is where coffee comes in, kind of as the anti-alcohol.
Precisely. In the 17th century, coffee arrives in Europe and quickly gets associated with mental alertness, clear thinking, productivity.
The opposite of alcohol's effects.
Exactly, directly contrasting with the perceived dulling, intoxicating effects of alcohol. Coffee started to symbolize rationality, industry, alongside its actual stimulant effects.
It's fascinating how a simple drink could represent such different values. Okay, so the wealthier classes start embracing coffee, maybe more moderation with alcohol. What's happening with drinking and other substances during the Industrial Revolution, especially for the working classes?
Well, alcohol didn't vanish from upper-class life, but consumption did tend to become more private, maybe in clubs or at home.
Right.
But for the lower strata in the 17th and 18th centuries, who were largely shut out of coffee culture, it was extensive, had different social ties, alcohol continued to symbolize solidarity, community, a brief escape from harsh lives.
And then the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century just throws everything into chaos, it sounds like. A huge impact on substance use.
Absolutely huge. The brutal realities of industrialization, long hours, low pay, terrible living conditions, just profoundly worsened the misery for the working class.
So drinking became more of an escape.
For many, yes. It shifted from maybe traditional social rituals towards a desperate escape. And crucially, distilled beverages spirits, with their high alcohol content and quick hit, became the drink of the proletariat.
The hard stuff.
Exactly. It was like the physiological and social opposite of the bourgeois coffee.
Mm.
And remember, spirits had mostly been medicinal before. Suddenly they were widely available, much stronger than the old beers and wines.
So that shift to stronger spirits was a big, probably more problematic change. What about other drugs during this massive upheaval?
The 19th century also saw widespread use of opium as a tranquilizer, a painkiller, especially among working people early on. Cannabis also gained some popularity, particularly in, avant-garde artistic and literary circles.
Oh, okay.
But the real game changers, addiction-wise, were the production of morphine in 1817 and then heroin in 1874. products of the German chemical revolution.
And you mentioned these had a similar impact on the drug market as spirits did on the alcohol market. How so?
Just like spirits offered a stronger, faster way to feel alcohol's effects. Morphine and heroin were far more potent and fast-acting than raw opium.
More bang for your buck, sort of.
In a way, yeah. But that increased potency, while initially seen as a medical miracle for pain, also carried a much, much higher risk of dependence and devastating side effects. It caused huge social problems. Morphine especially was used extensively in military hospitals during the big 19th century wars, Crimean War, American Civil War.
Leading to addiction among soldiers?
Exactly. Many soldiers returned home addicted.
It's sobering, isn't it? The role of war and even well-intentioned medical advances in fueling addiction. And this eventually led to the first attempts at regulation.
Yes. The growing awareness of opium's harms led the British to pass the Pharmacy and Poisons Act in 1868, trying to regulate its sale.
Right.
Plus, you had the whole situation with the East India Company's opium trade with China, which was devastating for China, led to the Opium Wars that really highlighted the international side of things.
A global issue even then.
Definitely. By the time World War I was approaching, the first international agreements trying to regulate narcotics were being signed. People were starting to recognize this wasn't just a local problem.
Okay, so the 20th century begins against this backdrop of rising concern, early regulation attempts. How did things evolve then?
Well, that widespread, often heavy drinking of distilled spirits, especially among the working class during industrialization, really fueled powerful temperance movements in Europe and the U.S.
Right, wanting to ban alcohol.
Exactly. And these movements were often underpinned by something called degeneration theory.
Degeneration theory, what's that?
It was this widely held, though ultimately flawed, idea back then. It suggested that things like biological weakness, bad environments, or moral failings could lead to this progressive worsening of social, moral, and medical problems across generations.
Sounds pretty bleak.
It was. And it heavily influenced how people understood addiction and its supposed impact on society.
So what were the practical outcomes? What policies came from that kind of thinking?
Well, proponents of degenerationism and the temperance movement were very active politically, lobbying, activism, and it ultimately led to the huge experiment of prohibition in the U.S. from 1919 to 1933.
Right. The ban on alcohol. Did it work?
Well, it did seem to reduce overall alcohol consumption, but it also inadvertently led to a massive surge in illegal production and distribution bootlegging.
The mafia, Al Capone.
Exactly. Plus, a rise in medical problems from dangerous, unregulated moonshine and the flourishing of organized crime. Prohibition was eventually repealed during the Great Depression.
A stark example of how bans can backfire, really. And degeneration theory had even darker implications.
Tragically, yes. Some medical experts subscribing to this pseudoscience actually advocated for forced sterilization of people deemed severe alcoholics.
That's horrific.
It is. And it was a policy later adopted and expanded by the Nazi regime. A really disturbing connection.
Definitely something important to remember. Thankfully, attitudes did start shifting towards a more medical understanding later on.
Yes. Starting around the early 1930s, there was this growing acceptance of alcoholism as more of an illness, less just a moral failing.
Okay.
The founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, during this time was a huge milestone, offering that mutual support model.
Right.
And the first dedicated drug clinic in the U.S., Narcotic Farm Lexington, opened in 1935. That signaled a move towards a more clinical approach to drug dependence.
So a significant shift away from purely moral views towards seeing it as a public health issue needing treatment. But fear around narcotic drugs persisted for longer.
Oh, absolutely. Until the 1960s, Western society, still reeling from depressions and world wars, largely viewed narcotics with intense fear and suspicion.
Seen as a threat.
Yeah, often portrayed as threats to social order, traditional values.
Yeah.
Substances that could lead to ruin, societal breakdown.
And then the 1960s brought another huge and quite different shift in attitudes.
Yeah, the counterculture movement. Fueled by the post-war baby boomers, relative economic prosperity, it saw this fascinating transformation in how drugs were seen and used.
Mind expansion.
Exactly.
Good.
Concepts like mind expansion, seeking personal self-discovery through altered states,
Right.
that gained real traction among young people.
Right.
And traditional symbols of adulthood, like smoking and drinking, were often contrasted with cannabis and psychedelics, which were seen as representing maybe detachment from norms,
Yeah.
a path to new experiences, the whole me experience idea.
A real cultural upheaval, and drugs were definitely tangled up in that. But while that specific youth movement faded, The underlying trends in substance use kept evolving.
Yes, while the specific cultural symbols might change, the overall prevalence of alcohol and drug use has generally continued to rise in many places.
Hmm.
And that medicalization of addiction, starting back in the 30s, has become even more dominant. Addiction is now largely framed by science and medicine as a chronic, treatable brain disease. But, and this is really important for you to understand, in many sociocultural settings, addiction still carries a significant moral judgment. A lot of social stigma remains.
It's a complex tension, isn't it, between the medical view and the moral view, still shaping things today. Now, I want to zoom in on that really interesting period, 19th century American opiate addiction. One of the most striking things is who is most likely to be addicted.
It is quite remarkable and definitely challenges modern stereotypes. In 19th century America, opiate addicts were actually more likely to be women than men.
Really? More women?
Yeah. Surveys from places like Michigan, Chicago, Iowa in the late 1870s, 1880s, they consistently showed females making up 61% to 72% of their samples of opiate users.
Wow.
And a detailed Chicago survey of drugstore opium customers found fewer than a third of the female customers were prostitutes, which goes against the stereotype. Tennessee reports from the early 1900s showed similar findings for opium and morphine.
That completely flips the script on the usual image. Why? What were the reasons for this higher prevalence among women back then?
Well, there were several factors working together. Early medical texts even had gender-specific dosing for opiates, usually lower doses for women.
Which might have made them seem safer.
Exactly. It might have inadvertently created this perception among both doctors and female patients that these drugs were somehow safer for women.
So even the medical establishment had different practices based on gender for these powerful drugs.
Pretty much. And the typical profile of a female opiate user then, often a white woman, upper or middle class, frequently keeping her use a secret.
Any famous examples?
Oh, yes. Well-known writers like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, George Sand, Louisa May Alcott, actresses like Sarah Bernhardt, even social reformers like Jane Addams apparently experimented or became dependent.
It's eye-opening thinking of these accomplished figures struggling secretly. What about ordinary women? What were their occupations?
The most common occupation listed in surveys was housewife, reflecting women's roles then. But unmarried female addicts were also found among domestics, teachers, actresses, and yes, prostitutes too. There were also mentions of harried society ladies and women in medicine itself having higher rates.
It really sounds like a big part of this ties into how women's health, physical and emotional, was understood and treated back then.
Absolutely. The growth of female addiction early to mid-century was strongly linked to the widespread, often casual use of laudanum and patent medicines for things like female troubles, nervousness, melancholy.
Vague term.
Very vague. Often catch-alls for what we might now call depression or anxiety. Painful conditions like dysmenorrhea, other gynecological issues, combined with male doctors often diagnosing these fuzzy diseases of a nervous character, likely led to opiates being prescribed very frequently.
And then the hypodermic needle arrives later in the century and makes things even worse.
Yes, late 19th century, injecting morphine with the new hypodermic syringe started replacing oral laudanum in many cases.
Right.
And ironically, the wife of Dr. Alexander Wood, who popularized the syringe, is thought to be the first known morphine needle addict. By the 1880s, injecting morphine was routine for a huge range of women's ailments, anemia, insomnia, even morning sickness.
It sounds like doctors were reaching for the morphine needle for almost any complaint a woman had. And the very restrictive social rules for women then probably played a role in non-medical use too, right?
Precisely. The Victorian society had such strict rules for women's behavior. Few acceptable outlets for stress or distress.
Yeah.
Drinking alcohol, smoking tobacco, those were seen as male vices, mostly off-limits for respectable women. So some more rebellious, independent, creative women might have turned to opiates, perhaps to explore experiences or find solace in a way alcohol couldn't offer them socially.
That's a fascinating insight how social norms actually influence which substances people choose. And it wasn't always solitary, was it? Men sometimes introduced women to drugs?
Yes, there are accounts of men sharing drugs with wives, sweethearts, mistresses. Sigmund Freud famously sent cocaine to his fiancée.
Right, I remember that.
And you see opium use inspiring creativity, like Maria White Lowell's poetry.
Yeah.
And of course, Eugene O'Neill's play, Long Day's Journey into Night, gives this powerful portrayal of his own mother's morphine addiction.
It really blurs the lines between medical use and recreational use back then, and shows how interwoven it was in some circles. And that seems true for cocaine and cannabis too, among artists and writers.
Exactly. Cocaine and cannabis were becoming fashionable among certain intellectuals and artists. Coca-based patent medicines, like Vin Mariani, were marketed directly to upper-class women, even got celebrity endorsements.
Huh.
Even early Coca-Cola was marketed as both medicine and a temperance drink, containing coca leaf extracts. And there were discreet places, like hashish houses with private rooms just for ladies.
Wow. It paints a picture of much more widespread, socially integrated opiate use, at least in some parts of society, than we might imagine for the 19th century. But this visibility, especially the problems seen in high society, eventually helped fuel the push for anti-opiate laws.
Yes, as the negative consequences became more known, maybe sensationalized, especially among more visible upper-class women, it played a big role in fueling public demand for laws. Concerns about degeneracy among these women were a major motivator for some reformers.
Right.
Published accounts like Confessions of a Young Lady Laudanum Drinker also fanned the flames. And then there was the really troubling issue of infant doping.
Infant dope.
Yeah, laudanum-based medicines like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup were widely given to babies to keep them quiet. This caused huge public outcry, contributed to early studies on infant mortality, and played a role in England passing the Pharmacy Act of 1868, the first opiate prohibition law in the West.
So concerns about women and children were central to those early drug controls, and as the 20th century started, the typical addict profile began to shift again.
It did. By the early 20th century, that older generation of mostly female morphine and opium addicts started dying out. They were largely replaced, in the public eye anyway, by a new demographic. Young men, often from tougher backgrounds, often introduced to drugs illicitly, sometimes via prostitutes.
A different image entirely.
Completely. Older women interviewed later sometimes remembered a time when addiction didn't carry such intense stigma. Younger women falling into addiction often told stories involving injuries, friends, difficult home lives. The public image of the female addict just transformed from that secretive, maybe legally supplied Victorian user to the criminalized junkie, the social outcast. A harmful stereotype that, sadly, still echoes today.
It's a powerful illustration of how the social idea of addiction, who the addict is, can change so dramatically, often driven by biases. Now, let's dig a bit deeper into why this 19th century American opiate addiction got so widespread. Doctors played a huge role, you said.
Oh, absolutely central.
Right.
Doctors back then widely overprescribed opium, morphine, laudanum for just an incredible range of things. Pain relief, sure, but also menstrual cramps, vague nervous conditions, asthma, headaches, stomach problems.
A cure.
It was seen that way by many. One historian called morphine a kind of magic wand for doctors because it worked so fast for pain.
And this led to a massive public health problem.
Huge. By 1895, estimates suggest about 1 in 200 Americans was addicted. That's staggering.
Wow.
Opium use wasn't new. It was around since the Revolution. Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton used it. But the Civil War just massively amplified the problem.
How so?
The Union Army alone issued nearly 10 million opium pills. Plus powders, tinctures. Many veterans became addicted or kept using for war wounds. And then the hypodermic syringe became common in the 1870s.
Making it easier to use, more potent.
Exactly. Rapid delivery straight into the bloodstream made overuse and dependence much more likely.
And the medical marketplace itself was pretty unregulated.
Very much so. By 1888, opiates were like 15% of all prescriptions in Boston. In 1890, doctors could prescribe pretty freely, and pharmacists could often sell opium preparations directly to people self-medicating, no prescription needed.
Right.
And as we mentioned, some doctors even believed uterine or ovarian problems caused more female opium addiction than anything else. Shows the state of medical understanding.
Even though warnings about addiction were starting to appear in journals, they weren't really heeded.
Correct. Warnings started in the 1870s, 1880s, but uptake was slow, partly due to poor medical education on addiction, lack of good alternatives for pain, and maybe even financial pressures. Demand from wealthy patients, competition between doctors and pharmacies. These could incentivize sticking with narcotics.
So what finally turned the tide around 1895? What started the decline?
It was a combination of things. Big advances in medicine and public health germ theory acceptance, vaccines, x-rays, new painkillers like aspirin provided alternative.
Okay.
Better sanitation reduced diseases opiates were used for symptomatically. And crucially, more effort went into educating doctors about the dangers. Medical journals started criticizing quick reliance on morphine injections.
Right.
And finally, new state laws between 1895 and 1915 started restricting opiate sales mainly to prescriptions. Ended the easy over-the-counter access.
A multi-pronged approach, really. Science, education, regulation. Now, as medically driven addictions started to decline, the way opium was used and seen changed again, didn't it, with opium smoking?
Yes. From the 1870s to the 1910s, opium smoking spread, largely brought by Chinese immigrants who set up opium dens in cities.
Okay.
These dens initially served Chinese laborers, but also started attracting white Americans, especially lower-class urban men. This shift in who was seen using opium significantly changed public perception
Yeah.
and created a political opening for prohibitionists.
How did that work? The reaction was different based on who the users were?
Exactly. As long as the typical addict was seen as that middle-aged white woman using morphine medically, there wasn't a huge public push for criminalization.
Right.
It was seen as maybe a tragedy, a medical issue, maybe a family secret, but not a major threat needing harsh laws.
But when the image shifted,
When the image shifted to young, working-class men, especially linked with Chinese immigrants, gambling, the urban underworld, the public and political reaction became much more punitive, less sympathetic.
it really shows how social bias shakes drug policy, doesn't it? Often more than just public health. And the federal government got involved too, driven by some unexpected factors.
Yeah, the federal push for an opium ban was partly motivated by, believe it or not, colonial ambitions in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War.
The Philippines.
Yeah, the opium trade there was a big issue. American missionaries urged President Roosevelt to address it, leading to an international commission in Shanghai. Ironically, the U.S. itself didn't have national opium regulation
A
then.
bit hypocritical, maybe.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Secretary of State Elihu Root then introduced a bill to ban importing smoking opium and punish possession in the U.S. Since it was associated with Chinese immigrants, gamblers, prostitutes, there wasn't much political opposition.
So the law passed.
Passed in 1909. But the ban decreased supply, drove up prices, which unfortunately pushed many addicts towards more potent stuff like morphine and heroin.
Unintended consequences again. And then came the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, a really big one.
Huge. Initially framed as regulating medical use of opium and cocaine, the Treasury Department enforced it really strictly, moving towards near prohibition for non-medical use. They especially targeted doctors who prescribed opiates just to maintain an addict's habit, arguing it wasn't legitimate medicine. The Supreme Court upheld this in 1919.
Right.
For a brief time, cities opened short-term narcotic clinics, maybe early precursors to methadone clinics. But the Treasury's narcotic division shut most down by 1921.
A missed opportunity, perhaps.
Possibly. Interestingly, a few clinics focusing on long-term maintenance for older, sicker addicts actually showed some success, suggesting maintenance therapy could work, a lesson maybe learned much later.
Makes you wonder. Now, before we wrap up, let's touch on one more key part of this 19th century picture. Patent medicines. They were everywhere, right?
Absolutely everywhere. The term patent medicine came from English letters patent, basically monopolies for secret remedies back in the 17th century.
Okay.
But in the U.S., few were actually patented. The term just came to mean any prepackaged medicine sold over the counter, no prescription needed.
So basically an unregulated free-for-all for selling supposed cures.
Pretty much, yeah. Early English ones were popular in the colonies. Then Americans started making their own. It became a hugely profitable trade. So profitable, the government taxed them during the Civil War and Spanish-American War to raise funds.
No. And the late 19th century was the golden age for these. Why then?
Several things came together. Industrial growth, city living, national advertising taking off, and crucially, no effective federal drug regulation.
Right.
Plus, a lot of public distrust of heroic medicine, bloodletting, harsh purgatives. Patent medicines promising easy, often tasty cures seemed way more appealing before germ theory and real scientific medicine took hold.
And the marketing was pretty aggressive and maybe not entirely honest.
Oh, absolutely. They were marketing pioneers, often deceptively. Trademarks, fancy packaging, catchy slogans, mail order, free samples, huge newspaper ads, testimonials often fake. Very aggressive.
And what was actually in these things? Potent, undisclosed ingredients.
That's the critical part for you to understand. Before the first Food and Drug Act in 1906, makers could claim anything. Their products often had dangerously high, undeclared levels of alcohol, opium, morphine, cocaine, other narcotics.
So that's why they seem to work sometimes.
Exactly. The addictive ingredients often provided the quick relief, leading to repeat business. Many were marketed as panaceas, cure-alls for everything imaginable with totally exaggerated claims.
Incredibly dangerous. What finally led to regulation?
Growing criticism. from citizen groups, ethical politicians, investigative journalists. Samuel Hopkins' Adams series, The Great American Fraud in Collier's magazine was huge, exposed the deceptive ads and dangerous contents.
Public pressure.
Exactly. That public outcry helped push through the first federal Food and Drug Act in 1906. It was limited, but it required labeling certain ingredients, alcohol, narcotics, and banned false claims on the label. A major first step. It was strengthened later, eventually replaced by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. The period from 1906 to 1918 is sometimes called the guarantee period because makers could put guaranteed under the Food and Drugs Act on labels, though it didn't mean the product worked.
So a big move towards consumer protection. And in a way, the legacy of patent medicines is still with us in the over-the-counter market today.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Despite huge advances in regulations, self-medication is still incredibly popular. We don't call them patent medicines, but the huge array of OTC products, the direct-to-consumer advertising, it definitely echoes the methods pioneered back then.
It's a fascinating full circle. Well, as we bring this deep dive to a close, it's clear our relationship with psychoactive substances has been anything but simple.
Not at all. From those ancient, maybe nutritional or ritual uses to medicinal roles, and finally to the complexities of addiction as we see it now. It's just deeply interwoven with our cultural evolution. The 19th century especially is such a powerful case study. Shows how medical practices, social norms, economic forces can accidentally fuel dependence. And maybe more importantly, how shifting who we think the addict is can dramatically change how society and politicians respond.
And it really makes you think, listener, considering this long, often cyclical history, are our current approaches to addiction really that new? Or are we still wrestling with echoes of the past? What can we learn from these cycles as we navigate today's challenges with substance use? This deep dive really shows the conversation is far from over. Understanding these cultural roots might just be key to a more informed, maybe more compassionate future. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.